In the fall of 1984, a group of economic students and economists from across China gathered for a conference in a mountain retreat called Moganshan outside of Shanghai. They met for 7 days, 7 nights, and they were there to really answer one question: how could China catch up to the West?
The overwhelming impression of China today remains that of backwardness. Horse and human power still do the chores machines would do better.
China was basically in shambles. Mao Zedong had died only a few years earlier, and he had devastated the country with his political campaigns. More than 1 million people had been killed or persecuted, and still about 3/4 of the population was living in extreme poverty. The government decided what every factory made, how much everything cost. The economy wasn't really functioning.
For the average worker, the most sought-after consumer items are a major investment. A good locally made television at $300 is nearly half a year's salary.
So as they were emerging from this isolation and this devastation, they looked out on the rest of the world, and they saw that they were far, far behind.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history.
The United States was the world's largest economy.
Nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes.
Ronald Reagan was declaring morning in America again.
Under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better.
Democracy, capitalism seemed to be working, while communism, authoritarianism had failed in China.
So what these students are up to is a major undertaking.
No, it was a huge challenge. They faced political opposition, bureaucratic opposition. What they were talking about would have gotten them thrown in jail just a few years earlier, probably. No communist country had successfully done what they were proposing to do.
And what were they proposing to do?
So these economists, these students, they batted around a lot of ideas. There was very intense debate, often late into the night, and one of the issues they'd been debating was what to do about the factories, which were following orders from the state. Some of them said that the factories had to meet these quotas, otherwise the planned economy would fall apart. And others said the only way to get the economy to grow again was to let the factories make what they wanted. And late one night, they came up with a quietly radical idea. The factories would meet the state quotas, but they would begin producing other material and selling it at any price they wanted.
So literally the idea was factories would meet all their obligations under a very restrictive communist economy. And once they had done that, they could tiptoe into the world of capitalism kind of on the side.
That's right. They were basically sneaking in capitalism while continuing to call themselves communist without giving up any of their authoritarian control over politics.
Western observers think the dismantling of price controls after more than 30 years of communist rule could be politically explosive.
So the West thought that this would never work. The prevailing assumption was that capitalism would not function properly without political freedom. The idea was that these bureaucrats in the authoritarian system, they would defend their control of the economy, they would block change, they would crush market forces. On the other hand,
experts are urging caution about all this. The Chinese may be planning too much too soon.
As people got wealthier, as capitalism began to take hold, people were expected to demand more from their government. They would demand political rights, and the government would eventually have to open up. Basically, the West saw this as a fundamental mismatch. You can't have capitalism and authoritarianism working together. That the Chinese experiment was basically going to fail. Either the economy would fail or the authoritarian system would fail. But of course, they were dead wrong.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. From the very beginning, the West was certain that China would not pull this experiment off. That certainty came from a set of assumptions about how societies function and why democracy wins out. We were wrong about those assumptions, and as my colleague Phil Pan reports from Beijing, China is stronger than ever. It's Tuesday, December 4th.
Assumption number 1. Government-controlled economies stifle growth.
So take us back to this group of economics students. They come up with this idea, and then what happens?
Well, somebody wrote up a report. It was delivered to the leadership, and to everyone's surprise, the leadership adopted it almost immediately.
The sweeping changes were approved by a meeting of China's top communists, and the supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping, wants them working in 3 to 5 years.
They were just desperate enough that they jumped on it. And it really kicked off the whole period of economic reform that allows China to take off.
Market forces will be allowed to operate in many areas.
They began sending officials overseas to learn how markets work.
The emphasis is on creating a new, educated elite dedicated to modernizing China.
Getting rid of the system that gives men the same wages regardless of how much they produce.
They opened up the economy to allow foreign investment, foreign ideas in, including from some of their old enemies, such as the United States, Japan, and Taiwan.
It is China's policy to open up to the whole world with no discrimination against any country.
China's Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, who spent most of today in Houston, arrived in Seattle tonight, where he'll spend the final 2 days of his American tour before returning to Peking Monday.
During this entire period, the United States and much of the West was heavily invested in China's success.
Tomorrow he tours the Boeing plant, which makes the planes China is buying to expand its national airline.
They became China's largest trading partner. They were one of, if not the biggest source of foreign investment inside China.
The Chinese now hope the Americans will help further develop China's oil, especially by selling technology for offshore deepwater drilling.
If it weren't for American investment and American trade, it's quite possible China would not have ended up this way.
Deng, who had earlier visited the NASA Space Center, later remarked, it wasn't often that a Chinese could become an astronaut and a cowboy in one day.
The idea was that trade with China would change China. What actually happened was that trade with China strengthened the party, but it brought political change to the United States and to communities around the world. China grew so fast and its manufacturing sector was so successful that factories around the world shut down. And in the United States, the economists say at least 2 million jobs were lost due just to the rise of the Chinese manufacturing sector. Basically, China's timing was perfect. They were opening up just as globalization was sweeping the world, and they were perfectly positioned to basically become the factory to the rest of the world.
So if the Chinese government is supporting this, what's its role in it?
Well, all around the economic growth was state control. They continued to control key sectors of the economy. This was a one-party state, no elections, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of religion. There were no labor movements. People began to push back against this early on in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square movement.
Hundreds of thousands of students and workers and other hopeful Chinese citizens had been seeking a peaceful dialogue with the leaders of this vast nation, received instead the harshest of responses to their demands for reform and freedom. Last night, an estimated 30,000 Chinese army troops were sent into the capital to crush what the government called a small band of hooligans and gangsters.
And the government completely shut that down with a massacre.
Some lost their lives when armored personnel carriers and troop trucks simply ran over them. Others were gunned down as they tried to resist the savage show of force. It is difficult not to use the word massacre to describe what happened.
So that sent a signal that there was this line that the party would never cross. They would allow enough freedom to grow the economy, but they would never allow people to challenge their control of the government.
So bring us up to speed on China's economic status today.
Well, China now is the world's second largest economy.
Here comes China, the country overtaking Japan now as the number 2 economy in the world.
It's on track to surpass the United States very soon.
Experts say that China could even pass the U.S. and grab the top spot by 2030.
As a result, it's a leader in social mobility. It has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. That's twice as many as even live in the United States. If you're an 18-year-old in China, your prospects for sort of rising, both in terms of social class and in income level, are much higher than if you're an 18-year-old in the United States.
Polls show that 75% of Chinese millennials, they are optimistic about their future. They think their country's going to run the world. In the United States, millennials, it's about 25% think that they're optimistic.
So at a time when the American dream in the United States feels like it's slipping away, something like the American dream has really captivated the Chinese population. And the Chinese president now, Xi Jinping, even calls this the Chinese dream.
So in that sense, the U.S. and the West were quite wrong. You could have all this economic growth without any major political reform.
That's right. There was basically a bargain. The party delivered a better life for people, and they stayed out of politics. Assumption number 2, the internet cannot be tamed and will lead to political freedom. So about 15 years after that meeting of economists in the mountains, China had become an economic force.
Thank you very much, President Bodie.
And then came the internet, and people thought this would be it.
We know how much the internet has changed America, and we are already an open society. Imagine how much it could change China.
That it would just put so much pressure on the Communist Party that the party would have to open up.
Now, there's no question China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck. That's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall.
And of course, it didn't work out that way. The West was completely wrong.
How so?
Well, in the beginning, it was quite free. There were only a few websites that were blocked. Information was spreading much faster than the Communist Party was used to. And then as social media developed, there was a platform called Weibo. And in 2011, there was a crisis.
On Saturday, July the 23rd, 40 people were killed and nearly 200 injured after a high-speed train crashed into a stalled train in China's eastern Zhejiang province.
It seemed like the government's worst nightmares were coming true.
Chinese railway authorities are being hit by an outpour of public anger.
Millions of messages critical of the government's call for a media blackout and their response to the crash itself have appeared online.
People finally had a way to organize and express their discontent with the Communist Party.
Now, 94% in a Sina Weibo poll say that they're dissatisfied with the government's role and that they're not showing respect for human life. If you'll take a look at that.
They thought about shutting down the platform completely. Instead, they decided to just invest more in control. They hired hundreds more censors. They required companies to do the same. They upgraded the technology they use to sort of filter information on the internet. And they've managed to ride out the threat that the internet posed.
So what does censorship on the Chinese internet look like?
Well, when you go online, you wouldn't even be able to tell right away that censorship is going on.
Yeah, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's a very vibrant world there, just like it is in the United States. There are crazy memes, cat videos, people pulling pranks. A lot of live video blogging nowadays. But if you type in Tiananmen Square on their search engine, Baidu, you see no results about the massacre. If you type in a message about democracy or human rights on the main chat platform, WeChat, you may eventually be arrested. If you are a live blogger, a video blogger, and you're doing a show. Recently, one of these women sang the national anthem in a funny way. you could be visited by the state security and warned, if not detained.
All of the censorship seems like it would require vast resources and time, cost. I wonder if it would be easier for China to have kept the internet at bay and to have essentially rejected it rather than to go to all this trouble.
Yeah, there's no doubt it's really expensive what they're doing. But overall, this was a big gamble by the party, and it's really paid off. The internet is one of the most vibrant sectors of the economy now. It's created billions and billions of dollars of economic value. So the cost of censorship, while significant, really pales in comparison to the overall value of the internet to the Chinese economy. And it has some of the most valuable internet companies in the world right now. In fact, only American companies can sort of rival the Chinese ones. They've got Alibaba, which is their answer to Amazon.
Alibaba has just filed for what may be one of the largest IPOs in history.
It is now, I think, worth over $400 billion. Wow. There's a company called Tencent.
More than 2/3 of the population use Tencent's two messaging apps, WeChat and QQ.
They have a search engine similar to Google called Baidu.
And one analyst described Baidu's latest earnings, Mariam, as destroying expectations.
It solves the government's problems because it doesn't produce any of the sort of problematic material.
But has the internet served to empower the people and weaken the government the way that we assumed it would?
Well, I think it really has opened up more space for speech, more space for criticism of the government. It is still the most free media platform out there in China, something that didn't exist before. But I think what we didn't anticipate was how useful a tool it would become for the government as well. The government uses it to monitor public opinion. The government uses it to surveil its own citizens. And the government uses it very effectively to sort of get its own message out. It floods the internet with the positive message that the party is good for China. In some ways, like, China sees what's happened in the United States and it just shakes its head. It's like they went down the wrong road with the internet. We did it the right way. We don't have any of those problems. Having so much freedom of speech on the internet, some people say it's contributed to political division. It's allowed the flourishing of fake news and political interference by other countries. China doesn't have to worry about any of that. Basically, Bill Clinton was wrong. China found a way to live with the internet and to harness it for its own purposes.
Tomorrow, in part 2, the United States didn't just misunderstand how China would respond to economic growth. The U.S. misunderstood how it would respond to China. We'll be right back.
You know Alexis Ohanian, tech entrepreneur and co-founder of Initialized Capital and Reddit. He's been traveling across the U.S., learning a lot about who is really making the American economy tick. And it's not millennial startups. It's businesses founded by baby boomers and Gen Xers. While Silicon Valley has been innovating its way into the headlines, these other generations have also been busy pushing the economy forward. Listen to Business Schooled, free on Apple Podcasts, to find out how the rest of America is doing business. A podcast by Synchrony.
Here's what else you need to know today.
China has reneged on deals in the past. What gives you more encouragement this time around, and specifically what gives you more encouragement?
Well, this is the furthest and most specific we've ever come. I mean, it's a good question. The history here with China promises is not very good.
On Monday, the Trump administration defended a truce it has reached with China's president, Xi Jinping, to temporarily end a months-long trade war between the two countries that has affected hundreds of billions of dollars in products.
However, I will say this, President Xi has never been this involved. I mean, the presentation he gave to President Trump and the rest of us at dinner Saturday night was unbelievable, remarkable. And the chemistry between him and President Trump was also remarkable.
President Trump's chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, said that President Xi promised immediate action on a range of issues, including China's trade deficit with the U.S. and its practice of requiring U.S. companies to share secret technology as a condition of doing business there.
I think President Xi, therefore, is being candid and truthful. The level of detail is important. We heard things we'd never heard before.
But the Times reports that the 90-day truce involves no concrete commitments, raising fears that nothing will meaningfully change and that a trade war could resume.
Color me hopeful, please. Again, we'll see. But I will say this. They cannot slow walk this, stall this, meander this. Their word, immediate. So I expect to see, let's say, confirming results.
That's it for The Daily. I'm Michael Barbaro. See you tomorrow.
Did you know the crash cart was invented by a nurse and color-coded IVs to reduce medication errors and sunlight therapy for babies with jaundice? Because nurses spend more time with patients than any other healthcare professional, that intimate knowledge has led nurses to invent countless life-saving devices and techniques. Nurses are with us at every step, and for 120 years, Johnson & Johnson has been in step with nurses, providing employment, scholarships, and training so they can improve the future of healthcare. Nurses change lives, and that changes everything.
Oh. My daughter is playing piano in the background. I'm worried that's going to get picked up, so...
Not ideal.
Yeah, my wife will get her off the piano, I hope. Okay.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. Today, when China first began experimenting with capitalism in the 1980s, the West was certain it would fail. But two of its assumptions were quickly proven wrong: that government-controlled economies stifle growth, and that the internet cannot be tamed. 40 years later, as China rivals the U.S. as a global superpower, its continued success is challenging not just our assumptions about China, but our assumptions about ourselves. It's Wednesday, December 5th.
Assumption number 3. The U.S. would influence China, not the other way around.
What's going on?
So there's this movie, Red Dawn.
Phil Pan is the Asia editor for The Times.
It was released in 2012. It tells the story of an invasion of the United States in Spokane, Washington. Enemy planes are flying overhead. Soldiers are parachuting in. I think one of the planes crashes into a house and there's a big explosion. And there's like a sort of American resistance movement against this enemy. In the movie, the enemy is North Korea, but it wasn't always that way.
Who was it?
Originally, the enemy was China, but the script got leaked.
This evil villain and his soldiers had Chinese nationality when the film was first shot.
The Chinese government objected very publicly.
But a state-controlled newspaper ran articles with headlines like, "American movie plants hostile seeds against China."
And Hollywood completely retreated, spent more than $1 million editing the movie, refilming parts of it.
There was visual effects work that we had to do to paint out propaganda posters and flags on uniforms and that type of thing.
To make it North Korea as the invader.
And why did Hollywood relent on this and change the enemy from China to North Korea in this film?
Well, China has developed extraordinary authority around the world over its own image, over how it's presented.
Now,
Now, China's box office is well on the road to becoming the world's largest.
And it's been able to do that because of the size of its economy, essentially.
Last year, China's box office hit a record of about $1.5 billion in receipts.
Huge strides being made by China in the world of entertainment here.
New numbers show China's box office surpassing North America's for the very first time this week.
It is now the biggest box office market in the world, even bigger than the United States.
China's box office could be double the total box office of North America's by the year 2025.
It is also a major source of financing for Hollywood films.
It's sort of a funny story, sort of.
The new Bridget Jones movie.
I'm not a master.
Kung Fu Panda 3.
Oh, I'm the Dragon Warrior. I don't even know if I'm a panda.
That movie with Amy Schumer, I Feel Pretty.
Shut up forever.
Wonder Woman, the new Mission Impossible.
What?
Actually, a few Tom Cruise movies.
I am not a hero. I'm a drifter with nothing to lose. I mean to beat you to death and drink your blood from a boot.
Basically, 8 or 9 blockbuster movies every year.
So basically, Hollywood's financial relationship with China comes with strings attached to it.
That's right. They sort of get that their image around the world is not great, and they've been trying to shape it.
3, 2, 1.
For example, there was this movie a few years ago called Pixels. Emails leaked from Sony show that originally the movie called for a hole to be blasted in the Great Wall, but executives were concerned about how China would react. So instead, they rewrote the scene and had the Taj Mahal being blown up instead. They were very concerned about, A, getting access to the Chinese market, and B, how the film would do in China.
China has made it very plain. It just won't tolerate what it views as transgressive behavior by Hollywood.
So essentially, Hollywood studios are afraid of offending China.
They're afraid of offending China because China will punish them.
We are all gonna die.
Just think, Michael, like, what is the last movie that you've seen where China was the bad guy?
I actually don't think I can recall one.
I remember one, which was this movie with Richard Gere called Red Corner.
I mean, I wonder what year it was. Oh my God, 1997.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Jack Moore is a brilliant attorney.
It was about an American businessman who goes to China and gets mixed up in a conspiracy/corruption/murder mystery.
Lin, Hong Lin.
So you do speak English.
And it portrayed China in a very negative light, especially the Chinese police.
But here, justice doesn't translate.
As a result, Richard Gere was blacklisted.
So, do we just say goodbye now?
None of his movies are released there.
I'll never be the same.
Neither will I.
I don't think he's even allowed to go to China.
You should go.
Brad Pitt has been punished because Brad Pitt was involved in a movie about Tibet.
Brad Pitt banned from the country nearly 20 years ago.
So it's just the market power that China has developed. And it's not just Hollywood.
China is forcing the world's most valuable company to bow to its censorship rules.
Apple has been removing apps from the App Store that China has objected to, including the New York Times.
It's Beijing's latest move to suppress the newspaper's output in China as it cracks down on dissent.
Apple has been giving into a lot of Chinese government rules and regulations on all sorts of things. So
Google, which has its motto of "Don't be evil."
8 years ago, Google shut down its search engine in China because of censorship and hacking there.
They famously withdrew from the Chinese market a few years ago.
At the time, Google's co-founder said the following: "Our objection is to those forces of totalitarianism. Our hope is that there is progress and a more open internet in China." Well, since that quote was released, the times have changed.
Now they are developing a search engine that will cater to the censors in China.
According to multiple reports, Google is working on a censored search engine just for China.
So if the assumption was that China would bend to sort of the rest of the world's cultural and political expectations. In reality, many Western companies are bending to China's will instead.
When you go into a country and participate in the market, you are subject to the laws and regulations of that country. And so your choice is, do you participate? Or do you stand on the sideline and yell at how things should be? And my own view very strongly is you show up and you participate. You get in the arena because nothing ever changes from the sideline. You know, nothing ever changes from there.
Assumption number 4. As people get richer, political freedom will follow. From the beginning of our story to now, we've gone through multiple generations of Chinese leaders. Ever since Deng Xiaoping, there's been this hope that this leader will be the one who does what Gorbachev did, that this leader will be the one who finally opens up the political system, allows elections, and makes China more like the United States, essentially. So by the time Xi Jinping takes power as president and party secretary in 2012, China now is a completely different place than it was in the 1980s.
My biggest dream is to buy a house, a car, and to get married. I have just graduated 6 months ago. The income here, I think I can realize my dream in 2, maybe 3 years.
As a university graduate, I run my own business.
China is already a major economy. There's a great deal of prosperity. Much of the population has already been lifted out of poverty. And a lot of people are wondering what's next.
The country being rich and strong, we the people are well off. That's my dream.
Because people are richer, because there's this big middle class, the demands on the party are far greater. They want a lot more than just economic growth.
Now, China is paying a toxic price for its economic boom. Dense smog caused by coal fumes, vehicle exhaust, and other pollutants has prompted thousands of Chinese to say, enough is enough.
If weather pollution cannot be improved fundamentally, we are still worried.
They want clean air. They want safe food. They want better public services, especially better health care.
I'm grateful to the government and also hope we can enjoy more beneficiary policies.
That's a lot harder for the party to deliver, in theory, as an authoritarian state than if they opened up politically.
I have no problem with a rising, powerful China, this man tells me. But he adds, I hope one day we too can have democracy.
You know, this would be the moment, perhaps, that they really begin to undergo some democratic reform to meet that popular demand and finally prove the Western assumptions to be right.
China's leader Xi Jinping is promising unprecedented reforms.
But instead, Xi has taken the country in a different direction.
President Xi Jinping visited top state media outlets in February, urging the press to pledge loyalty to the Communist Party.
He's actually doubled down on authoritarianism. It's tighter now in China in many ways than it was a decade ago.
A political mystery is being written in Hong Kong, where 5 people who either publish or sell books critical of China's communist government have disappeared.
Xi Jinping is trying to strengthen control over what people can see and say on the internet.
Protesters carry photos of jailed Chinese journalist Gao Yu. She and others are arrested for criticizing their own government.
45 journalists in jail. I was reading that China is the leading jailer of journalists in the world. Is that correct?
It's an indicator of just how far this government is ready to go in China.
He's cracked down on civil society, on journalists, on religion.
Evidence is growing that up to 1 million Muslim Uyghurs are being held by Chinese authorities in so-called re-education camps under the pretext of security and countering terrorism and extremism.
You have no freedom at all. You must do everything according to the rules set by the Communist Party.
recite what they say, sing red songs, thank the party, think like a robot. You do whatever you are told.
It calls for psychological counselling, behavioural correction, and thought education. But in plain English, we might call it brainwashing.
So he's really taken a much more conventional authoritarian posture as a leader than even his predecessors.
Good morning, President Xi.
Phil, how can Xi get away with this? I understand why he would crack down at this moment, but with all of these increased demands, how can it be that the Chinese people are letting it happen?
You know, it's always difficult to measure public opinion in China because there's no way we can conduct surveys or anything like that. You know, I could say for sure that there has been a lot of criticism. There has been some blowback against Xi for doing this. But on the other hand, I think over the course of the last 40 years, what we've seen is that the party has managed to make a bargain with the people, which is the party delivers a better life for you as long as you stay out of politics. And so far, the people have been willing to take that.
Please stand up.
The party delivers as long as you leave the party alone.
You leave the party alone, you let the party stay in charge, and we will continue to give you economic growth, to give your children a better life.
I swear that I will be faithful to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, be loyal to the country and the people, and work hard to help build a great, modern, socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. Xi Jinping.
And the biggest blow to this idea that China was going to open up because of its new prosperity was when Xi Jinping decided earlier this year to eliminate term limits on the presidency. He basically now, if he wants to, can rule for the rest of his life.
Right. What could be a greater emblem of authoritarianism than a single figure ruling for life?
Right.
And Phil, what has it meant for the United States that we've been operating as if we knew how this story would end for China, but it hasn't actually happened that way?
The assumption was that we could control how China rose, that we could change China, that we would always be in charge.
The trade war between the United States and China has escalated.
It is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control.
President Trump set to announce new tariffs on China today, the move already triggering retaliation from Beijing.
Chinese have imposed a raft of tariffs of up to 25% on more than 120 products.
They've turned the tables on us.
The Chinese know that the U.S. can't afford a trade war with China.
China has grown so successful and so quickly and is so intertwined now with our economy.
The American Soybean Association estimates that more than $6 billion has been lost over the last month as a direct result of the trade feud.
That we're no longer completely in charge.
The decrease in prices we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks would amount to probably $150,000 for me.
110,000 jobs in rural America are directly tied to exports of pork. A trade war could put some of these at risk if U.S. pork gets too expensive for Chinese clients.
Yeah, it is a significant hit.
We have to come to grips with the idea that we're no longer the only superpower. I mean, we've been the only superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union. That's like 25 plus years. And today, that's no longer the case. We have to learn now to live with and or compete against another superpower. But unlike the Soviet Union, this superpower is completely intertwined in our lives. For China to fail in the way the Soviet Union failed would be disastrous for the American economy.
We are following developing news out of the G20 summit where President Trump and China's president agreed to a truce in the trade war. President Trump says the U.S. will postpone raising tariffs on Chinese goods for 90 days. In return, China has reportedly agreed to purchase a substantial amount of U.S. products to reduce the trade imbalance between the two countries.
At this point, if China failed, that would be more problematic in many ways for the American economy than if China succeeded. So we're in a very difficult situation now because our relationship is basically bound together in a way that we never expected it to be.
Phil, with everything that you're laying out here, this is starting to feel like China's rise to power, its ability to square authoritarianism with capitalism, something that the U.S. thought was such a contradiction, is maybe not that much of a contradiction at all. That perhaps the U.S. has been wrong about what it means to be a superpower from the beginning.
Yes, I think that's right. For 40 years, we've made these assumptions about how modernization works, and China has completely charted its own path. They've taken a completely different direction than we thought they would go. They've shown the world a different way to achieve economic growth. And I think that's really challenging the United States and all over the world, because China has sort of presented itself as a different model now. And it comes at a time when there are serious questions about the American way all around the world, including in the United States. When democracy itself is under strain, China is saying, here's another way. And I think that's something that really rubs many Americans the wrong way.
On Tuesday, a temporary truce in the trade war between the U.S. and China, celebrated by both sides as a breakthrough, appeared to unravel. In a tweet, President Trump seemed to issue a new threat against China. President Xi and I want this deal to happen, and it probably will, he wrote. But if not, remember, I am a tariff man. When people or countries come in to raid the great wealth of our nation, I want them to pay for the privilege of doing so. Within hours, the U.S. stock market plunged, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average falling nearly 800 points. We'll be right back.
You know Alexis Ohanian, tech entrepreneur and co-founder of Initialized Capital and Reddit. He's been traveling across the U.S., learning a lot about who is really making the American economy tick. And it's not millennial startups. It's businesses founded by baby boomers and Gen Xers. While Silicon Valley has been innovating its way into the headlines, these other generations have also been busy pushing the economy forward. Listen to Business Schooled, free on Apple Podcasts, to find out how the rest of America is doing business. A podcast by Synchrony.
Here's what else you need to know today.
I have zero question in my mind that the Crown Prince, MBS, ordered the killing, monitored the killing, knew exactly what was happening, planned it in advance. If he was in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes, guilty.
On Tuesday, after a briefing by the director of the CIA, a bipartisan group of senators said they were more confident than ever that Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, ordered the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
There's not a smoking gun, there's a smoking saw. You have to be willfully blind not to come to the conclusion that this was orchestrated and organized by people under the command of MBS.
The senators, including Republicans Bob Corker of Tennessee and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, rejected claims by senior Trump administration officials that there is no evidence of bin Salman's role in the assassination, saying that judgment is clouded by the president's desire to protect the crown prince.
I would really question somebody's judgment if they couldn't figure this out. It is there to be figured out. And I think the reason they don't draw the conclusion that he's complicit is because the administration doesn't want to go down that road, not because there's not evidence to suggest he's complicit.
The senators said they were determined to find ways to punish bin Salman, such as ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or withdrawing U.S. military support for the Saudi war in Yemen.
I want to make sure that Saudi Arabia is put on notice that business as usual has come to an end for me.
That's it for The Daily. I'm Michael Barbaro. See you tomorrow.
Did you know the crash cart was invented by a nurse? And color-coded IVs to reduce medication errors? And sunlight therapy for babies with jaundice? Because nurses spend more time with patients than any other healthcare professional, that intimate knowledge has led nurses to invent countless life-saving devices and techniques. Nurses are with us at every step, and for 120 years, Johnson & Johnson has been in step with nurses, providing employment, scholarships, and training so they can improve the future of healthcare. Nurses change lives, and that changes everything.